Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bob. How
How
you
you
doing?
doing?
I'm good.
You look good. It looks like some sort of vacation setup you got going there behind you.
This is our little summery place in Guilford, Connecticut.
Oh, well, aren't we underprivileged? Let me
Well,
introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV and its sister site, its new sister site, Meaning of Life TV, on which this will appear. You are Paul Bloom, psychology professor at Yale, author of many books, public intellectual. Most recent book is called Just Babies, modestly subtitled, I think, The Origins of Good and Evil, or something like that. Before that, you wrote a book on pleasure called How Pleasure Works. Another book of modest aspiration. The Just Babies book was about the whole kind of development of the human moral infrastructure early on in the lifetime of a human being. Just is a pun, I think it's safe to say.
it is safe to say, though, very few of the readers got it.
Really.
I thought it was, my wife Karen Wynn thought it up. I thought it was brilliant. I just like swooned when I heard it, and very few people got it.
So would we call this a life-changing marketing blunder?
It may well be. Another public intellectual, who I won't name, got an advance copy of the book and sent me an email saying, if you can, you have to change the title. The title is a disaster. The book will sink. No one will get it. They will think the book is exclusively about babies and will be angry to discover that you're talking about other things as well.
Anger is a form of publicity. That's a source of publicity. That anger is not a bad thing. But did it get that?
Oh yeah, people send me angry emails saying,
Good.
your book's called Just Babies, but chapter 6 isn't about babies. And chapter 7 has a little bit of babies, and they were really quite annoyed.
They wanted
I-
wall-to-wall babies.
Pardon me?
They wanted wall-to-wall babies.
They wanted all babies. They wanted just babies.
Just babies.
Yeah. I hate people. I hate readers.
Yeah, it's a common view of authors. But the book didn't sink without a trace.
I know.
Got attention.
It's sunk, but there were bubbles and ripples. I was happy with
There
it.
were traces.
It was fun. It was fun to write. It got me thinking about a lot of issues. Got good debates going. I enjoyed writing these books.
So much so that you're working on one now,
As a matter of fact,
which will not consume our entire discussion because I think you've got writer fatigue, apparently, when it comes to thinking about this subject. But is it safe to say that this is about compassion, empathy? You've written about this publicly already, so your views are out there. And is it safe to say that you will not rest until all compassion and empathy is expunged from this planet?
that is not quite right. I would draw a distinction between empathy and compassion.
Ooh.
Compassion is a sort of a disinterested, abstract caring for other people. I'm all in favor of.
Mm-hmm.
I will not rest until empathy is gone from the world, stripped from our brains, till every empathic person is left swinging from the lamppost. I mean, I want to eradicate empathy from conversation. But
Well, good luck.
compassion, I'm all for.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Well, that's an important distinction, and we could start out with that. And if any of the viewers who complained about Chapter 6 not having anything about babies are listening to this, we should emphasize that you were exaggerating in a jokey way when you said, I think that you wanted to, execute all people who feel empathy or something. I think you would say empathy may have its place, but its virtues are exaggerated. Is that your view?
Yeah, people are always trying to make me more reasonable.
Oh, sorry.
Let me put it this way. I think empathy is a very poor moral guide. I think empathy makes us worse people. I think feeling other people's pain leads to bias and often savagery. We're much better off with other moral emotions. But I'm not against empathy. Empathy can serve other purposes. So empathy, for instance, most of all is a great source of pleasure. So, if I ever write another book after my empathy book, it might be about the attraction of stories. And one thing about stories is TV shows, plays, novels, is the joy of empathically putting yourself in the shoes of another person, of being, Hamlet or Tony Soprano. And that's an immense pleasure. I also think
So wait, it's okay if the people don't really exist?
well, it's a source of pleasure. So even if they exist, I might get a lot of pleasure putting myself in someone's shoes, living or non-living, imaginary or historical or real. And I think that pleasure's part of our life. I wrote something for the New York Times about a month ago, arguing we're very bad at putting ourselves in people's shoes. We're much worse than we think we are at knowing what it's like to be Bob Wright, let alone somebody in Africa or somebody from the 17th century. On the other hand, we love trying. We love the feeling of imagining what it's like to be another person. And I think it's a genuine source of pleasure, and I'm not against that.
Now, you would concede that, at least on occasion, some good things have come from empathy, right? I mean, you see somebody on the road who needs medical attention, and you feel their pain. I might not necessarily. I might be more drawn to the compassion side of things and just like more kind of objectively sense their need. But you might be drawn by empathy to save a life, right? That's happening.
I would concede that. I would even say, quote, approvingly, a lot of laboratory studies done by Dan Batson and others showing that if I'm watching you in pain and I'm instructed to feel your pain, to put myself in your shoes, I become more likely to help you. Mm-hmm. I would also point out that sometimes people feeling what it's like to be another person, say a prisoner in solitary confinement, could motivate positive social change. Mm-hmm. I like that example because Atul Gawande wrote a wonderful New Yorker article about what it's like to be in solitary confinement, describing it very vividly. And as a result of reading that, I felt, well, now I'm against it. I agree. It's a form of torture. I'm against it. Mm-hmm. And, if that's positive moral change, empathy has led to it. So it would be crazy for me to deny that something as ubiquitous and powerful as empathy can't lead to good things. I would just say that the bad things outweigh the good things.
Mm-hmm. So that's a helpful qualification. Now, you mentioned Dan Batson, psychologist who's possibly most famous for this kind of quasi-experiment he did at Princeton Theological Seminary, the Good Samaritan experiment. I guess we needn't get into that, although I encourage people to Google it because it's really interesting, and maybe we'll have time to get in it later in the conversation. But I know one thing he has done is get into some of the kind of subdivisions within empathy. Well, one distinction you sometimes hear is there's emotional empathy, feeling their pain, and then there's cognitive empathy. I don't think this is Dan's terminology, but there's cognitive empathy, which is just understanding what their perspective is. Now, I know that he has certainly gotten into comparable kind of distinctions within the realm of empathy, and I assume these matter. And maybe it's somewhat what you were hinting at in distinguishing between empathy and compassion. But how do you break down the different things we may mean by empathy?
Right, you assume, right, that there's all sorts of meanings that the word empathy has. And, I'm not here to legislate how people use the language. There's all sorts of ways you might reasonably use the term. Under some usages, it's uncontroversial empathy is good. So some people just use empathy to mean to be good, to be moral, to be kind. I read a couple of days ago something arguing that Steve Jobs was an incredibly unempathic person. Mm-hmm. But then it went on to just describe rotten things he did. And all I mean by unempathic means not a good guy. Empathic means good guy. Under that version of empathy, I'm all in favor of empathy. It just means to be in favor of good things. Another notion of empathy is cognitive empathy, figuring out what other people are thinking and believing. In that case, I'm also for it. I mean, if you didn't have it, you wouldn't be able to survive. You wouldn't be able to do any good. I would note that it's not necessarily a force for good. A real SOB, a seducer, a con man, even a violent psychopath can be very good at getting into the heads of other people. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, to be a good person, you also need to know what other people like. Mm-hmm. That's not what I'm arguing against either. The sense of empathy which I'm targeting is what Adam Smith and his cohorts would call sympathy, which is feeling the pain of other people. And a lot of psychologists use this term too. It's related to emotional contagion, but you could also feel empathy when you imagine the plight of another person. And it's this that a lot of people have argued is a special force for good, and it's this that I'm arguing against. But I would distinguish it from compassion or caring or kindness, which is valuing another person without necessarily inheriting their bad feelings. And so I was working on the distinction, and then I discovered, and you would be interested in this, that Buddhism and Buddhist theology and Buddhist philosophy makes a lot of this distinction. So I was talking to, for instance, I was on a panel last week in Aspen with Richie Davidson, who does a lot of work on this, and he was enthusiastically saying, look, empathy sucks. Empathy is a disaster because you don't want to get caught up in the other person's pain. What the great teachers of Buddhism, like the Dalai Lama, would argue is that you want a more distant compassion. Loving kindness, you guys call it. Does that ring true at all?
I hadn't thought of it quite that way. I mean, it's certainly true that the word of choice these days is loving kindness, or metta in Pali, and so the language of Pali, and so metta meditation, metta with two T's, refers to this loving kindness meditation. I was just trying to think, I've been steered through loving kindness meditation, which, to be honest, is not my favorite form of meditation. It's the one kind of meditation that more or less drives me completely nuts. But I've been subjected to it, and I'm trying to think. They what they do is they steer you. They say, yeah, it's more about directing love and kindness toward the person than, I guess, putting yourself in their shoes.
That's right.
Strictly speaking, I guess that is the way they go through it. And by the way, I'm not against loving kindness at all. It's just that this particular kind of, for me, what feels like a heavy-handed approach to cultivating it just doesn't work. But
if I remember right, you're supposed to first direct it towards those you're close to, like your child, and then keep working outwards until you extend it to your worst enemies. Is that right?
Yeah, and usually the order differs. Some people start with yourself, like directed toward yourself, and like I run into trouble right there. It's like, I'm sorry, but I'm not that big a fan of myself in many ways. But all of them put yourself, I think, somewhere in it. In the spectrum, and yes, eventually you're supposed to start with somebody it's easy to direct love to, and you wind up with your worst enemy, but I guess it makes sense, the distinction he's attributing to Buddhism. I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms. So do you what's a good example of the damage that can be done by empathy, either an actual historical example or a made-up anecdote, or what?
I'll give you two quick examples.
Okay.
One is from American history, is the case of Willie Horton. So Willie Horton, as people of our age will know, was somebody let out pardoned by Michael Dukakis, who was governor of Massachusetts, and went on to rape a woman and assault her fiancé. Mm-hmm. The furlough program that let him out was considered to be a humiliating failure, and this was one of the reasons why Dukakis lost the election, one of many reasons. Later on, they analyzed the data from the furlough program, and they found out actually it was a success. More, the criminals offended less if they went through the program. Mm-hmm. But the salient bad event that drew our attention to it was such that it was impossible to see it as a success. Mm-hmm. It would be as if a vaccine program where a child dies from taking the vaccine, we would shut down the program in a second, even if the program saved 100 kids. Because empathy resonates to pain and suffering. It doesn't resonate to statistical abstractions. It doesn't resonate to people who aren't raped and killed, people who don't get a disease. It can't respond to these negatives. It can only respond to singular salient cases. And so it's a poor guide to policy. The second example is war. So whenever a democratic country goes to war, what they do is the leaders draw your attention to the suffering of victims of the people they want you to attack. This happened before we invaded Iraq. Mm-hmm. The newspapers, there were still newspapers then, were filled with stories of the atrocities of Saddam Hussein and his monster children. When we bombed Syria, there was endless reports about the poison gas attacks. When we go to the extent we ever go to war against ISIS, those videos of people being executed are going to get shown over and over again. Mm-hmm. Now, in some sense, this is rational. It's a fair argument in favor of intervention to say people are suffering at the hands of those that we should attack. But empathy greatly overvalues our concern for it.
Although
tremendous empathy for the victims, and then we're motivated to attack their oppressors.
Although in principle, empathy could be used to counterbalance that very thing. I mean, two things could kind of empathy, and then the more cognitive empathy, like perspective taking. So, for starters, you could point out that we're going to kill a lot of people in Iraq if we invade them, and even in the best case, if the people are mainly soldiers, put yourself in the shoes of this Iraqi kid and grows up and winds up through some set of circumstances that could have happened to anybody, winds up in the army. It's not like everybody you kill is Saddam Hussein, assuming that's like the one thing you would consider morally defensible. So empathy could work there, and then perspective taking. Well, let me get your reaction to that first. So that's the more emotional kind of empathy.
Yeah, you're entirely right in principle. But there's two reasons why the empathy for the victim is greater than empathy for the Iraqi soldier. One is the victim is typically a specific individual. A story is told of a specific individual and their suffering. The Iraqi soldier is a statistical abstraction. You'd say you'd have to kind of arbitrarily think of one, but there's no specific...
Before the invasion, he's hypothetical is the problem. But...
Exactly. Hypothetical. He's like a victim of climate change. I'm sure there are many victims of climate change. Show me one. Well, we can't show you one. They're statistical.
Yeah.
Who do I empathize with? So that's the point one, which is you're comparing an individual with a hypothetical or statistical abstraction. Individuals evoke empathy. Stats don't. And the second concern is often the victim is chosen to be somebody who's inherently a natural target for empathy. A child, someone who looks like you, someone who seems to be like you. While the person on the other side is an enemy, is part of the outgroup.
But if you take, once the war has started, and maybe this is especially applicable to kind of ongoing endless forms of war, like our drone strike campaign of the last decade plus, I've seen stories where they look at who was actually killed, some 12-year-old whose father happened to be whatever, and, so it's not a necessarily militaristic... I think ultimately, in a way, you can tell the stories on either side, and I think in a way the question becomes, what is influencing which stories succeed in getting through our communications infrastructure into the living rooms of people? And it seems to me there you wind up not talking about inherent properties of empathy so much as a lot of complicated stuff about human psychology and the distribution of power in society and so on, right?
I would agree with that. I mean, empathy can be used to direct your focus in any which direction. I think in the American political scheme, the conservative-liberal conflict is often described as a battle between people with less empathy and people with more empathy. In reality, I think most interesting debates, you can use empathy either way. If you're worried about gun control, you can have empathy for the victims of gun violence. If you want guns to be more available, you would instill empathy for people who are defenseless against violent criminals. Mm-hmm. And in foreign policy, if you're against drone strikes, you could try to instill empathy for assuming that they're children and ideally light-skinned and kind of like you get empathy for the victims of drone strikes. Mm-hmm. But empathy will just skew things in an irrational way. So there are cases where there's kind of a cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis, and the cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis might say, don't go to war because so many people will die. But you could use empathy to even the playing field and push for war. Mm-hmm. And so when somebody like Obama or Bush or Blair or anybody tries to get a country into war, don't just kind of appeal to genocidal rage or hatred. Often they won't do that at all. They'll talk about victims. They will portray victims in great detail. Sure. And that's a catalyst.
True. Now, as for kind of cognitive empathy or perspective taking, there I'd see a separate kind of value, which is often the people who want to go to war want to depict the leaders of the society they want to invade as single-mindedly malicious and nefarious as possible. And they want to interpret everything in that light. So, like, if Saddam Hussein doesn't want us to interview his scientists, although in generally he was very yielding in terms of the inspection, something that people forget, that he really was letting us look at everything we wanted to look at. But if he doesn't want us to interview his scientists, that must mean there is an active nuclear weapons. Well, in retrospect, there must have been another explanation because he didn't have an active program, and and it wouldn't have taken a lot of imagination, right, to think of other reasons he might. One is the sheer humiliation. Leaders don't like to be leaders like to sacrifice as little sovereignty as possible to external powers because, for one thing, they lose respect in the eyes of their people the more they surrender and the more they're humiliated. There are all kinds of explanations for this, and that's a case where just putting yourself in the shoes of the other person in a cognitive sense, I think, can be an anti-war activity.
I entirely agree. I mean, you've written a lot on this, and you've made the case, which I think is right, that we have to work harder to understand what's going on in the minds of people who hate us, who disagree with us, who often might want to kill us. In part because this is a proper moral stance, but also in part, even if you accept that there's an ongoing conflict, to handle ourselves better, more successfully, even to win, if it's sort of a zero-sum interaction, we need to know what's going on in the minds of other people. And there's this awful cognitive, just like emotional empathy proper fades when you're dealing with a Saddam Hussein or a Hitler, or even somebody just very alien people. Cognitive empathy also fades. Mm-hmm. We tend to think of these people as, Roy Baumeister talks about the myth of pure evil, which is often we tend to think of these individuals as just evil incarnate. Just they do evil things because they're evil people and they love evil and and that's not how humans work. People are evil and do rotten things, but it's very rare that they, maybe non-existent, that they see themselves as evil monsters. They have reasons. Right.
I think true sociopaths may not have convinced themselves that they're doing great work, but everyone else, I think, has. I mean, everyone else who does bad things that we would consider bad, and I think that this includes most of the monsters of history, the great monsters of history in the 20th century in particular. I have no doubt that they thought that in their own mind they justified what they were doing in the name of the greater good or something, or in some other way.
And even garden variety sociopaths and psychopaths, or these where they interview serial rapists in prison. And the serial rapists are loaded with self-pity. Why me? Why am I getting picked out? The women were asking for it. They didn't complain. Why do people make such a big deal about it? Mm-hmm. They don't think, God, I'm this horrible person who destroys people's lives. Right. They think they're the victims.
Right. So here we get to some other aspects of human nature that impinge on kind of moral conduct. So let's take the first thing you mentioned, like the tendency to view leaders of other societies that we're having particular tensions or conflict with as just unredeemably evil. Do you think that gets kind of a boost from natural human psychology? Because we don't do it with everybody. It's certainly not automatic. You don't think of all leaders that way. But on the other hand, it's a mindset that I think all of us are prone to.
I think it is, and I think it's encouraged. I think it's part of our fundamental natural way of approaching people, that the enemy is seen as less nuanced than your friend. I think it's also encouraged socially and culturally. So you could talk about it from sort of how we'd see Hitler or Saddam Hussein, but you could also see this in contemporary American politics, how a liberal might make sense of Jeb Bush or a conservative of Hillary Clinton, where my understanding, if you read Salon, which I tend to read a lot for masochistic pleasure, and Salon endlessly portrays the Republicans as these hideous monsters. 15 thuggish things Donald Trump said as he squished a baby under his shoes. And the thing is, A, it's not morally generous, and B, it leads you, even from a sort of strategic point of view, to underestimate the people you're clashing with. Mm-hmm. It's always a surprise to me when I see somebody who's been vilified by the press, or somebody and you actually see them in person or on stage, and they're typically a lot smarter and more decent and more rational than you would ever believe that they would be. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a bad human trait from a moral point of view, because it leads you to dismiss those you disagree with as horrible, but also just from a strategic point of view.
Right. So what do you say to people when they say, you've written about our moral infrastructure from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, looking at the human mind as an evolved thing. What do you say to people when they say, well, are humans naturally moral or not?
I say, yes.
Yes, in what sense of the word moral?
We have I think we have an innate, I've argued in my book, Just Babies, which has a wonderful title, that we have an innate hardwired morality given to us by evolution. We are blessed with compassion towards some of those around us, with a sense of right and wrong, capacities for guilt and shame and pride and gratitude. The standard Darwinian package that in the moral animal you spelled out, and it seems to be vindicated by all the developmental work going on. So that's the good side. We also have, I don't think there's such a thing as an impulse for evil. So it's not a perfectly symmetrical case that for good impulses there are parallel impulses that are purely malicious. But we do have a lot of self-interest. We want stuff. We want, and that's also the Darwinian story. We want safety and shelter and love and sex and food and status and power. And so we're at war with one another, with ourselves because of these impulses. And one of the arguments I made in Just Babies at the end of the book, when I stopped talking about babies, and that I'm going to continue in my empathy book, is that we could use our rationality and our reason to transcend the worst aspects of human nature. That's hardly a novel claim, but it's strangely unpopular in my field, where a lot of psychologists like to give tremendous emphasis to our moral sentiments and our gut feelings and our unconscious. And I want to say, look, our reason and our cool cognition and our rational deliberation can play a huge role in our lives. So for instance, I'm fond of the movement developed by Peter Singer, the altruism movement, effective altruism. Because those are people who are sort of saying, we want to make the world a better place. We're not going to do so by listening to our hearts. We're going to do so by collecting data. And I think that style of charity, that style of conflict and policy making, it sounds cold-blooded, but actually it just makes the world a better place. And it's really an important fact about people. We could engage in it.
Yeah. Now, when you said, okay, we are driven, we pursue status and we're in various ways self-interested, I think you said, and that puts us at war with ourselves.
Yes.
Now, that seems like a curious way to put it. I mean, I think to a Darwinian, the self is this thing that natural selection built, to the extent that it actually has any kind of solid existence, to be self-interested. So I would think, to the extent that you are selfish, you're not at war with yourself. That's yourself operating as designed, right? I mean, what am I missing?
So there's sort of a deep sense that we could worry about the notion of a self and what is a self.
Right.
And I kind of like to duck that because I'm trying to get my head around that a little bit. When I say at war for ourselves, I mean something, well, tell me if this makes sense. I mean, often we have impulses which push us in opposing directions. So I may have an impulse to enhance my status by taking credit for work I haven't done. At the same time, I'm a moral being. I know it's wrong. What I'm doing is unfair and unjust and makes the world a worse place and so on. So I feel I shouldn't do that. And much of life is a conflict between your moral impulses and your self-interested impulses. Now, the moral impulses are Darwinian, so in a sense, in some sort of ultimate sense, they are self-interested, but in an approximate sense, they could go against what would benefit me the most.
Okay, but you're describing a case where you're aware that you're kind of fudging, you're asking for more than you're due, you're judging someone unfairly. I mean, don't you think to a large extent we're designed to not be aware of it? And you're actually being exceptionally, you're not being an efficiently functioning human when you, and you're not functioning as designed when you are aware of your moral lapses. I mean, don't you think to a considerable extent these biases operate at a kind of unconscious level?
Yeah. I think so. So the cases where we're aware of the clash, you're right, maybe a sort of tip of the iceberg. The case where the self-deception machine breaks down. I think that I would agree with you. In a lot of our lives, there really is a clash between what we're doing and what we know to be right and what we know to be wrong. We just kind of fudge it internally, so it doesn't even make it to consciousness. We say, oh, I actually deserve the credit for this because, and that person deserves the bad thing I'm going to do to them because they had it coming, and it's karma and everything. And I don't even know all the fudging I'm doing. Right. It might be, it's just in sort of extreme cases where the wrong you're about to do is so bad, or has been pointed out to you by other people, that you can't delude yourself and you have to confront it.
Yeah. And there's also kind of a gray area, I think, where you got a feeling in your heart of hearts, if you push the self-examination a little further, there's clearly something there. You may have a slightly uneasy feeling, but you haven't really consciously articulated what you're doing wrong. I think there are kind of gradations of consciousness.
And then there's the other extreme, which is maybe this is the product of people who've seen too many therapists. But there are often times where we act and we feel we're doing something wrong. We have a sense of doing something wrong, even if we can't quite articulate it. I think you could self-delude yourself in the other way.
Right.
And kind of get caught up in shame or guilt and worry when you're actually doing something which is perfectly normal. And perfectly
Oh, yeah. I mean, especially as a result of your kind of early moral programming, I think, depending on what kinds of things your parents imbued.
Sexual examples come to mind, I guess.
Yeah. So, but I guess, an example of all of this that I think is important is the sense of justice. So I think you and I agree that people have, in some sense, an innate sense of justice. You demonstrate in Just Babies how early it surfaces. And by that we mean an intuition that good deeds should be rewarded and bad deeds should be punished.
Yes.
Right? But it seems to me that equally natural is a kind of a skewed accounting system, and it's often skewed at the unconscious level, in terms of what a good deed is and what a bad deed is. Good deeds are things that help us and our friends, to put an overly crude spin on it maybe, but bad things are things that hurt us and our friends. That's going a little too far. Maybe we're not quite that crude in our kind of innate calculus, but there is a kind of unconscious bias, right? So the fact that we have a sense of justice, if that's good news, it has some bad news built into it, right?
Our sense of justice is markedly limited in a couple of ways. One thing is, as you point out, it could be extremely biased. There's all these laboratory demonstrations by Dave DeSteno or David Pizarro, finding that when you ask people what's fair, what's just, how much should a person be punished or rewarded, it's exquisitely sensitive to in-group versus out-group. So somebody on your political party doing something, it may be A-okay. On the other party doing exactly the symmetrical thing, you're exquisitely sensitive to the badness. I mean, another issue, which is something that you've talked about, is that our intuitive sense of justice and our notion of punishment, I think, while it's evolved for consequentialist reasons, is non-consequentialist. We just want bad people to suffer. Right. And somebody, I somehow identify this view with you, because maybe we've spoken about it before, somebody of sort of a more consequentialist or more forgiving stance might say, we want bad people to become less bad. If we could do it without hurting them, all the better. If instead of putting a murderer in prison, we could give a murderer some ice cream that would make them happy and make them not murder anymore, and that would deter other murders, let's do that.
Right.
But that's not how our gut feels. Our gut feels is, if you kill my brother, you should pay.
Yeah, now I did argue, in The Moral Animal, I argued that if there's one refinement of thinking that should come from evolutionary psychology in the realm of kind of justice, it's to let go of the idea that for wrongdoers to suffer is an inherent good.
That's right.
It's to the extent that it serves pragmatic ends, fine. And I think you do have to punish people as a practical matter, whether to keep them off the streets if they're almost irredeemably dangerous, or to serve as an example of other would-be evildoers. There are plenty of reasons to punish people and so on, but we have, as an intuition, it's exactly as you said, the intuition evolved for consequentialist reasons because of how the consequences that the intuition had for our ancestors, which was in the end self-serving ones or gene-serving consequences. But the intuition itself is not consequentialist at all. It's this intuition that whenever someone who's done something bad suffers, that itself is good, even if it has no consequences. If you've got some shoplifter on a desert island, no one will ever find out what you did to them, and it will never serve any good, and they're going to die on the island in any event. You should still slap them around a little or something,
yes.
To serve justice.
Yes, that's actually sounds like an excellent experiment to run to get people's intuitions on that. But slap.
I think we should emphasize thought experiment.
thought
Neither of us wants funding to put shoplifters on islands and slap them.
It would bankrupt NSF and all for that one little experiment.
Right.
But yeah, so this is one of many cases where our evolved intuitions give rise to something which we could, as reasonable people, question. And this is one I have difficulties with, because I really do think the shoplifter should get slapped. And it's people like you and like Sam Harris and who would argue that I should rethink these things. And then the other way in which our evolved intuitions I think are untrustworthy is that they're relentlessly biased and parochial. And so they really favor the in-group over the out-group. Yeah. And that too, to some extent, is hard for me to shake. I'm never going to shake the view that not only do I love my children more than your children, I should love my children more than your children. But I recognize that often our bias there is way too extreme. We care way too much about the self and not enough about the other.
And the biases are subtler than the love itself, which is a very conspicuous thing. But suppose your child shoplifts. Well, you're more likely to see extenuating circumstances. And this actually gets us back to the early work of Daniel Batson, in the sense that it's about the attribution error, how we attribute motivation to people. Did they do this thing because they're bad people? Is that why they're shoplifters? Or did they do it because they didn't get their nap that day? Well, if it's our kids or our friends, it's because they didn't get their nap that day. And this is like a demonstrated feature of psychology, that with friends and allies, we appraise behavioral causality differently than with enemies. And that's a very consequential thing in world history. So the stuff works so subtly that it takes work.
It takes work. And that's what part of political discourse is. So the kind of argument I like a lot when people use it is, if somebody says what Obama is doing is fine, you say to them, yeah, but what if Bush did the same thing? Now, if the honest answer was it would be fine too, then it's fine. Then intuition is fine. But typically people, upon reflection, would say, yeah, if Bush used drones like Obama used drones, I'd be demonstrating against it. Mm-hmm. If the member of this political party that I'm opposed to behaved the way the person I like, I would view it in an entirely different way. And because we're capable of sort of adopting different hypothetical stances, we can, I think, calibrate our morality more. Mm-hmm. So if I say, oh, if my son shoplifted, he shouldn't be punished. But if I'm then asked, what about a third person? I say, oh yeah, that should be a severe punishment. I'm smart enough to say, wow, that's inconsistent. I got to recalibrate one way or another.
Right.
And that's what people can do.
Right. So I guess we certainly, we've covered a lot of stuff. We certainly agree that evolutionary psychology should be used as a basis for reflection and kind of self-reflection, right? That's a generally useful moral exercise, yes, to use what we know about our evolved nature to amend our actual behavior.
And which is very different from a view which some people might hold, but we don't, which is our evolved nature tells us what's right and wrong, that we should just sort of listen to our evolved nature, and from that all ethics will spill out. And that's not a view that we...
Right. I mean, it does tell us what's right and wrong, but I don't think and I agree. I mean, it gives us the sense that we know what's right and wrong, and it has... But neither you nor I think that it's infallible in that regard, and that we should subject those intuitions to reflection.
Yes. So we're making real progress here.
Yeah, because you and I are great people. And now it's just the rest of the world.
Yeah, the out group.
Yeah.
What do they know?
Well, since they are the out group, we could just kill them all.
Yeah, they wouldn't even notice. They're so mindless.
Yeah, that's the thing about out groups. Okay, this has been a lot of fun. I guess final question related to evolutionary psychology. You're an actual practicing academic out there in the wilds, carrying the banner of evolutionary psychology to some extent. I don't know how self-consciously you carry it, or to what extent you use the terminology, but I'm interested in your take on how it has fared. When you and I probably first encountered each other at a conference long ago, it was quite distinctly a minority enterprise, almost an insurgency within psychology. How would you state its current status?
I think evolutionary psychology has won. I think it's won so much that I think the term evolutionary psychology may turn out to be superfluous. It might be like evidence-based therapy, like what other kind of therapy is there, or efficient, effective altruism. You know,
Right.
those should be weird terms. And I think every psychology, I mean, obviously I think this, but I think many people think this now. Every psychology should be informed by evolutionary theory, as it should be informed by neuroscience, as it should be informed by development. This doesn't mean that everybody is going to agree on exactly how this informing should go. So there's a school by like Lita Cosmides and John Tooby who view the implications of evolutionary psych as a heavily modular mind with dedicated innate systems. There are other people who evolutionary psychology and say, no, what's evolved is more general and less domain specific. And those are perfectly legitimate differences you could argue about. But my sense of the field, and I may be mistaken, is that the days where talk about evolution had a vaguely fascist flavor to them, like it's kind of racist, fascist, bad thing, opposing Stephen Jay Gould and people, everybody, all the enlightened people knew that the evolution stuff was just crazy. Those days are gone. And now people are, I think, agreeing that these mental systems that we're talking about have evolved, and now arguing constructively about the details.
Right.
Does that fit your sense too?
More or less, yeah. In my sense is that pretty much all psychologists now feel they have to at least make approving noises about evolutionary psychology, whereas 25 years ago is the opposite. It was kind of required that you disdain it. And I don't know that all of them actually have a true appreciation of it, but certainly it's now legitimate to ask about anything in psychology. Well, is this a product of evolution? Is it, and why would it be so? And I agree that should be part of the conversation. And I think it's more and more accepted that it's far from having inherently right-wing implications, which was the original allegation. And I think our conversation today may demonstrate that the implications are not inherently right-wing.
That's right. So things have changed. Things have changed, I think, for the better.
Yeah. And so we can end it on that note. Well, thank you so much for taking time out, not only from your vacation, but from your relentless and ruthless war on empathy.
Yeah. Back to the barricades.
Back to the barricades, yes. Kill it wherever you see it.
I've noticed some empathic children at the beach over there, and I have to go speak to them.
We know what has to be done with them, don't we?
On that note, hey, thank you for having me on one of the early episodes of Meaning of Life.
Meaning of Life. Delighted to have you grace the site. Have fun.
Thank you.
See ya.